Democracy, Bridging Facts and Norms.
Right, I'm David Miller, Professor of Political Theory at Oxford. So I have a long academic career behind me, I suppose, now. And I studied philosophy and politics, philosophy at Cambridge and politics at Oxford, and began working originally on social justice, which was my doctoral thesis, and it's been a continuing interest of mine throughout my career, actually. But along it, I've also worked on a number of other topics, including in the 1980s. I was very interested in debates about concept of market socialism, and that led me, I think, in the 90s to interests in questions of citizenship, nationality, and democracy. Originally in connection with that, but then later on as a freestanding subject. So I wrote on nationality, but still retained an interest in questions of social justice. And then, like many people in the recent period, I've begun to think about questions that cross national and state borders, global questions, and so questions about human rights, questions about global justice, and this most recently questions about immigration, the political philosophy of immigration, where I've just finished writing a book on that particular subject. So I hope that a sort of theme that's run through my work has been the attempt to work between more philosophical analysis of concepts and principles and the use of various kinds of social scientific evidence to support political theories.
May I ask you why you chose to do your research in political theory and not more in applied political sciences?
Well, I think I'm interested, not that I'm disparaging political science at all, but I'm interested in the normative question, how should we live, how should we organise our lives together? I think it's a very important question to ask. So, and I think my particular skill is on that side of things. So I haven't set out to be a sort of first-order empirical researcher. What I've tried to do is assimilate and use the research that other people have done to illuminate questions in political philosophy. And I think that everybody has their particular, skill and bent. And mine, I think, has been to try to integrate those two fields.
And how do you select which kind of empirical research are going to be relevant to your own studies? Because it's often in social sciences we have lots of results that sometimes contradict each other, and yet we choose to give some more importance to some of these results in our theories. And then is the question, how do we select? Do you take the highest numbers of results that show a certain result, or do you take the scientific or the researchers that have done a particularly good study, or how to select in a sense which facts we're going to rely on when doing political theory?
Yes, I think what you look for are points of agreement among different researchers. So some little time back, when I was working on theories of social justice, I did a large study of the empirical work that's been done on people's perceptions of justice and on what's sometimes called their justice behaviour. That's how people actually act in situations where they have to make some kind of allocation. And so there are a huge number of surveys and experiments and so on, but actually I think you can see, though there are going to be some specific differences, there are some quite strong common themes that you can see coming through this. And interestingly, these sometimes, so for example, just to give an example, I think that what you might call the common sense idea of justice, the one that people actually use in practice, the idea of desert plays a very large part. Right? That people think that when people make a contribution or create more goods or work harder, they deserve to get more. That's very widespread, and you can see this running right through the empirical evidence. If you look at theories of justice, Rawls, Nozick, whoever, you find that that idea plays a very small part. So there's a kind of dissonance between the theory and what you find on the ground, and that's very interesting. And then you begin to ask, well, why is it that these philosophers have paid so little attention to an idea that seems very important? But as I say, you, rather than select one piece of evidence, you try to look for commonalities across many. So more recently, I was trying to do some work looking at, and this was different kind of empirical research. I wrote this paper called Testing the National Identity Argument, where I tried to survey with a collaborator all of the studies that have been done on the effects of national identification on people's attitudes towards redistribution, social justice, and so on and so forth. And again, trying to sort of see whether there were commonalities that run through. That was more difficult, actually. I found that a very hard task. Partly, I think, and the problem partly was that the conceptualizations being used by the empirical researchers didn't fit with the theoretical concepts often. So there were apparently contradictory findings, but I felt that these were sometimes explained by people conceptualizing ideas like national attachment, national loyalty, whatever, in different ways. So that's difficult then. I think one of the things you find, I mean, I've had this experience, occasionally I've gone to colleagues and said to them, look, could you insert this question into your next questionnaire, right? And they look at the question and say, no, we can't do that because people would not understand the question you're asking and the way you want to understand it. So there's always going to be this problem that the questions that sort of work in the sense that they can be incorporated into questionnaires and so forth or other kinds of study won't necessarily be exactly the one that the theorist wants to ask. So it's quite a difficult operation.
Yeah, so then does it mean that we would need some sort of translators to work between political theorists and empirical political scientists? Or who could do that work of translating what we mean as concepts in political theory and what can be operationalized in empirical studies?
Yeah, I think it's difficult. I mean, and it's made more difficult by the fact that as political science progresses, the level of technical expertise that's required also increases. So I think the new generation of political scientists are often highly trained in quantitative techniques, but that doesn't necessarily go with a great deal of sensitivity to, for example, conceptual questions. So it's going to be quite hard to find the kind of all-round person who has both of those talents, actually. And so maybe the only future is through collaborative work. Actually, I think that democratic theory is one of the areas where I think there's been more cross-fertilization, more collaboration than in other areas of political theory. So, for example, the literature on deliberative democracy, I think, is a good case where you have got quite sophisticated theoretical formulations, but also quite a lot now of empirical work on deliberation, experimental work, other kinds of work, looking at consultations, citizens' juries, these kinds of things. And I think that's probably, the collaborations are much stronger in that area than, for example, in the justice area. So that would be quite a promising area, I think, it's not the only, the deliberative democracies field is not the only field in which I think theory and practice need to come together. I mean, I've recently been doing some work about problems of democracy in divided societies, often sharply divided societies, and clearly there's quite a long sort of political sociological literature, but I think that doesn't always feed into discussions of democratic theory in the way that it should. In other words, I think democratic theory probably hasn't sufficiently addressed what you might call the minority problem, let's say. We sort of know that there's a problem for a democracy if one group is a persistent minority, but I think we haven't really, we tend not to take that as seriously as we should in democratic theory, but in real-world democracy it's very often a major problem. Perhaps not so much in the many of the most developed democracies, but in many of the other ones, it's a really serious problem. So again, that's an area I think where there's room for more interchange and collaboration.
So would you call this approach of taking seriously what happens in politics non-ideal theory or realism, or there are all those labels that are sometimes hard to distinguish? So what approach would it be in your conception of approaches to political theory to take these facts seriously and introduce them in political theory?
Yes, I mean, I don't find this discussion about ideal and non-ideal theory helpful, except in the very specific sense that was originally used by Rawls. In other words, I think there is an issue about what individuals should do under conditions in which principles of justice are not properly being followed. So there's an individual level question. So in that sense, ideal, non-ideal works. But in political theory in general, I mean, there's an issue in political theory, political philosophy, which is how much of what we see around us we should take for granted as being part of the givens against which political philosophy has to proceed. I mean, everybody thinks that there are some givens, that there are two human genders, for example. That's the kind of, we just take that as given. Though it's more complicated than that, but nonetheless, that's basically that's something we don't. So there are certain things we take as givens. And then the issue is what other things to take and what not. But that's a substantive question within political philosophy, and I think one of the sort of success criteria of political philosophy is precisely that it gets that right. So it's not that there are two kinds of theory, as it's sometimes suggested. It's rather that there's an ongoing debate within political philosophy about whether, take a question like, should we assume the state as a given? Right? That's a substantive question that a political philosophy has to address. You have to make a judgment about that. So I rather reject that non-ideal ideal distinction in favour of a question about how far should political philosophy embrace a specific set of feasibility constraints on its findings, things that we have to take as given for purposes of theorising. I think that's a much more fruitful way of asking the question.
And then probably those feasibility constraints that you adopt will have an impact on the kind of theory you will develop.
Yeah.
And then what do we do if it's later shown or that someone makes an argument that is very convincing to say that those feasibility constraints are actually not true and that, well, there can't be a society without a state, so we shouldn't start from that premise. What does it imply for the theory that we made if someone says, well, no, sorry, your basic assumption is wrong?
Right. Well, that's a very good example of where empirical evidence and so on, it comes into political theory. So somebody can say that, but to make that in any way a convincing claim, you would have to then produce evidence that that's the case. So that's exactly not the only role, but one of the main roles that empirical evidence gives us. It informs us about the boundaries of feasibility. But we should cast the net wide. I mean, we shouldn't just look at things that happen around in societies like ours. We should look more widely as well to get the answer to that question correct.
You said in the beginning that it is important to discuss about the normative ideals of our societies. What is, in your opinion, the aim of doing political theory?
Right. Of course, there is an internal aim to get things right, but it's not. It can't just be that. I think it's to inform public. In a democratic society, it informs public discussion. It provides the basic concepts and frameworks within which political debate should be carried on. And of course, it takes a while for these ideas to diffuse into public discourse, but they do eventually. And if you look at the sort of vocabulary of politics, the kinds of principles people appeal to and so on, you'll see that they shift over time, and political philosophy is always influencing that. It's educating people, it's educating future decision makers and so on. So I think it has a kind of guiding role within a democratic society. It would be different in a different kind of society, but in this sort. But so it always has these two. It has an academic aspect where you simply are trying to, develop the best account of what justice requires, something like that. But then it has this public account side too, where what you're trying to do is provide principles that people could actually use in making policy decisions.
And then does it mean, if it has an impact in democratic societies, does it mean that political theory could also harm societies by providing ideals that are so far away from reality that it could have bad impacts? And if that's the case, do we have a responsibility towards the society in which we discuss and to which we provide guidance, normative principles?
Yes, I do think that. I mean, I think that because it's important always to be aware that claims made in an academic and theoretical context sometimes can be taken up and used in ways that the person perhaps making them wouldn't have anticipated. So, and I think, for example, that when in discussions about, for example, the circumstances in which the use of force or violence is legitimate, I think one should be aware that you could have a kind of academic discussion about whether, for example, I've had these discussions about whether people in poverty would be justified in using forceful means to take property or territory from rich states. And you could have an academic discussion about this. I think when you have it, you should be aware that there's at least a possibility that some of the things you say might be taken away and developed in a way that would be dangerous. So I think there is a responsibility on the part of political philosophers to think a bit about how the ideas they're using might be employed.
So, for example, when you consider questions of nationalism and migration, do you take into account the fact that it might be referred to in actual policy making?
Yes, I do think about that, because obviously there you hope if you develop a theory that people would take it seriously, and so you need to be aware, I think, that the words you write might at some later point, somebody might use them to defend a policy that you might not be happy with, and then you should think a bit about whether you should take steps to avoid that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And is that part of what you call doing political theory in a democratic way, and this attitude of political theorists who should be modest towards what citizens think? That's something that you mentioned in your article about political theory for Earthlings, that political theory should be democratic, and I would like to know exactly what you mean by that.
Well, I think it should be democratic. It should engage with the set of political ideas that people have already. I mean, it shouldn't just defer to them. It should interrogate them, clarify them, and so on. But it should work with them. I think it should try and communicate to people out there, using language, using terms. So I'm very against the style in which political theory is written. It's often written in a very opaque, very academic, very convoluted, actually, way. And I've always tried, not always successfully, to write in a way that an intelligent citizen could sort of pick it up and can read it and sort of understand what was going on. And I think so even the way you write, I think, is part of this. But it's also a matter of, and this was what I was talking about when I was discussing the work on justice, to try to, if you're building a theory of justice, this should respond to, I think, the way that people actually think in practice about justice. As I say, you can interrogate, and in some cases you can say, well, people actually hold contradictory views or views that are at odds with the evidence or whatever, but nonetheless you work with the concepts that people have. And I think that is part of making political philosophy relevant and important to people in a democracy.
Thank you very much.
Brought to you by democracynet.eu.